I just wanted to take a few moments to mention a few things to you all. So, Osio Nagata, Wado for coming out tonight. We welcome you to our panel discussion, and we're very happy that you are here. My name is Violet Rush. You might remember me from earlier when I talked directly before the film started. I am a Cherokee Nation citizen and a Muscogee Creek descendant. I am also in my second year of law school at the University of Tulsa College of Law. And before we get the discussion started, I just want to take a moment to talk with you about the intentional nature of this panel so that you can connect to some of the overarching themes that our panelists are going to be discussing tonight. So we just saw a really incredible documentary about the use of Native people as mascots in Native cultural appropriation. And a lot of times when Native mascots are used, they tend to be depictions of indigenous men, although that's not always the case. However, as you might have noticed, there are no men on this panel. And as the organizer, I can promise you that this was completely intentional. And it was intentional because I wanted to seize this opportunity to work with others and create a space for discussing how issues of racial justice specifically affect indigenous women. Although it's not really widely discussed outside of Native spaces, indigenous women have been fighting for the survival and dignity of our communities since 1492. As many of you might be aware, prior to colonization, indigenous women were afforded great opportunity and held significant political, social, and spiritual power. However, colonialism subjected indigenous communities to a racist and patriarchal system, the effects of which are still deeply felt today. Some examples include decreased economic and political power, the displacement of matriarchal societies and ways of being, and the devaluing of indigenous birthing and motherhood practices. Because indigenous women still carry the burdens of colonization, we need to center their voices and experiences in discussions of race, economy, education, law, and government. If we do not center their voices, we displace them. And when indigenous women are displaced, oppressed, and marginalized to the point of invisibility, our communities suffer, our traditions fade, and our languages die. The displacement of indigenous women leads to crises of health, identity, and culture. Thankfully, we have a wonderful group of panelists with us here tonight, and they can all attest to the fact that indigenous women will always rise, they will always fight, and they will always establish the ties needed to ensure survival for our communities. So, first, I would like to introduce Cherrah Giles. She is a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation and of Cherokee descent. She has served for 10 years as a legislator for the Muscogee Creek Nation National Council and also serves as the chairwoman of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. She has received numerous awards for her service to her community and to indigenous women. Cherrah sees her responsibilities to indigenous people and her community as an extension of her role as a mother and career woman. She believes in the importance of being visible, accessible, and active with her family and greater Indian community. Cherrah makes her home in Jinx with her husband Justin and their children Tafa, Etya, Russell, and Ridge. Apvlvnev Piña is also a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation and Chicana. She is a researcher, stomp dancer, and community activist. While at the University of Oklahoma, she helped establish Indigenous Peoples Day. She is currently a researcher on a National Institutes of Health grant, which concerns the stereotyping of Native people by non-Native people. She continues to develop her service as an activist with her newfound role as a mother and as a chapter leader of Matriarch in Tulsa. Candessa Tehee is a full-blood Cherokee who grew up in a close-knit traditional Cherokee community where Cherokee language and culture were a mainstay. Candessa serves as assistant professor of American Indian Studies and as coordinator of the Cherokee Language Education and Cherokee Cultural Studies programs. In addition to her academic and career pursuits, Candessa is also an artist who works in the mediums of finger weaving, loom weaving, and pottery. Candessa makes her home in Tahlequah with her 3 children who attend Sequoia High School and the Cherokee Immersion Charter School. And last but definitely not least, we have Sarah Adams-Cornell, who is a member of the Choctaw Nation. and serves as executive director of Live Indigenous Oklahoma. She is also a co-creator of Matriarch, a program dedicated to empowering Native women. Recently, Cherrah took on the position of project manager for Sovereign Community School, a Native-centered charter school in Oklahoma City that fosters the development of young Indigenous leaders. Prior to this work, Cherrah served as an activist in residence at the University of Oklahoma and organized a movement to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day in Oklahoma City. Her and her daughters have learned the Choctaw language and enjoy singing, dancing, beading, basket making, dressmaking, and taking history classes to help preserve, pass on, and celebrate their heritage. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I will get the discussion started with this first question, and we will see where the conversation takes us. So thank you all for coming out tonight and spending your time with us. The first question that I have for you all is, how are you defining racial justice for Indigenous women, and specifically, what role does racial justice play in your work as an Indigenous activist and mother?
I guess I will go first since Cherrah just handed me the mic. Here you go.
Hi.
Can you all hear me very well? I can't ever tell with these things. So, first, I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out on this Thursday night and actually sticking around after the film for the Q&A session. I know you could probably go elsewhere, so we appreciate you hanging around. I'll just answer this question briefly and just say that and the type of activism I do and the way that I go about just living every day, I think I could probably speak for most everyone on this panel, is that for a lot of us, we kind of walk in two worlds. So when you wake up in the morning, you got to put on your Indigenous hat and you got to go out into a white world. And you have to learn how to walk in that world, and it's constantly a kind of internal battle of how do you maintain your identity as an Indigenous person, as, for me, Muscogee person, as a Chicana person, and...
Thank you, sir. I'm all...
So how do you maintain your Indigenous identity and be true to it and still hold on to a lot of your traditions, but you also are walking in a white world, and you also, by nature of that, by proxy, you are modern. You're a modern Indian in that way too. And what does a modern Indian look like? It looks like all of us, and it looks like my crying baby back there. It does not look like what we've seen in this movie.
It's a hard question, and Halito, everybody. Again, I second everything Apvlvnev said. And I just, first of all, have to say that I love that Jose is here. We're indigenizing spaces by bringing babies to these spaces. And I'm so glad that my husband is back there watching the baby. Way to go, Dustin.
Thanks.
But as far as racial justice and how that is a part of the work that we do, it is central to what we do, right? I mean, I think everything kind of centers around that and how, why we're doing what we do. And I say it all the time, I'd love to be out of a job. I'd love to not be needed in this work anymore, but unfortunately that I think we're going to have, we've still got more work to do. This film is incredibly important to center that racial justice conversation, especially in Oklahoma when we have lots of collegiate teams and we've got some crazy microphones. But it's central. I think that it's something that we're always talking about, we're always coming back around to. And something in the movie that I love that Suzanne said is that everything I see it this way, but they're all connected, all of these issues. You cannot pull out one of these issues about education without talking about cultural appropriation, without talking about the sexualization of our women, without talking about the rates of our women who are being abused and raped, you cannot talk about them in a silo. And so when we talk about racial justice, I love that this was a broad question, because we have to talk about all of it. And if we don't talk about all of it, and we don't talk about that cyclical nature of what we're dealing with, then we don't actually get to the meat of it. So I know there's a lot more to this question later, so I'll pass.
Thank you, Hish-J. I'm Cherrah Giles. I do want to acknowledge some people in the room, because I think for me, myself, growing up here in Tulsa area, I kind of relate to a lot of what was said, that for me, going to a school that didn't have anybody else that looked like me, and even though I was in a very urban area, there's a lot of Indians in Tulsa, but my school didn't have that. So anything I could relate to Indian was cool. Like, you wanted the Indian starter jacket back then, back in the day. We wanted those things because we didn't have those things. And I have mentors, and I want to acknowledge Alice Whitecloud, who's here in the room, and she's one of the founders of TICAR, which is Tulsa Indian Coalition Against Racism. And Lewis Gray, I believe, is a founder of TICAR, and there's others in the room that have been working on the issue, because we're still in this community where there's an R-word name at one of our local high schools. And so that has been an ongoing issue, and trying to teach our children and trying to teach the world, like, why is that offensive? How is that offensive? Because my daughter's sitting with me, and she has Down syndrome, and she doesn't quite understand what all that means, because, again, it's something cool. There's Indians. And I have to teach her what's the difference between that, and just how we have to go out into the world where we know, as Indians and as adults, as educated people, we think other Indians know. And that's the harsh, sad reality. There are other Indians that are on the other side of this conversation that are very still supportive of this, of that word, of that team name, and trying to change that conversation, and then gathering our partners and allies in the movement. For me as a mom, and I do a lot of work in domestic violence and sexual assault, as Sarah said it very well, like, all of that goes hand in hand, because when the rest of the world sees us as less than, we're not human, we're a mascot, all these other issues don't matter to them. They don't understand rape in Indian country. They don't understand jurisdictional issues. They don't understand sovereignty in tribal governments. So we have to keep telling that story, because a lot of people will say, well, there's more important issues. There's more important issues. Yeah, but this plays a part into all those other issues, because they're not seen as human. They're not seen, we're less than. I'd want to bring up my daughter, because every year we say, don't use the R word. She has Down syndrome. Well, there's 2 R words we don't use. And I have to share that with you, because ideally, I taught my kids, since they were little, don't say that word, because little kids, they like to say, oh, you're acting like R word. And I'd have to tell them. And they learned early on, my other children learned early on, we don't say that. And they got really good about telling their friends, don't use that word, don't say that word. And even though they weren't meaning it in a derogatory sense, or they weren't talking about my daughter specifically, they didn't understand what how hurtful that word was. And so over time, it's like, we got to add another R word to that, because other people don't understand those 2 words go hand in hand, and they are hurtful to people and what that means. And it's, we have to change that narrative, because it was so easy, as they said in the movie, to say Redskins, which they were not going to say the N word. And we should be in that conversation too, that we don't say the R word. We just don't. So when we look at the work that happens for all of us across Indian country, this is a part of it. This is a part of the work. We have to be there. And I'm sorry, I keep looking at Aragon, because she was in the film too, so I'll give her a shout out. Again, because that work is universal. And you know, you think a comic book, the artwork, the images that are going out there, we're changing that. And so all of that's a part. You know, who knew artwork from a comic book could be changing the national narrative and conversation about safety in our communities and the importance of our community. So all of it goes hand in hand. So I think all of that's important, and how this one issue of the millions of issues we have in Indian country plays a part in all of it, and we have to recognize that. And some of us have greater skills and strengths to put forth the time and energy into certain areas. And like I said, I work in domestic violence, sexual assault, and then language. Candessa is like the expert in language, and even though I may not know as much, I'm going to call Candessa, or I'm going to call Sarah. Those sorts of things. Like, we start learning who's our leaders out there, who's leading the movement, and saying, but how can I help? What part can I do? For me, and the work that we did in the Violence Against Women Act, it was just that was a huge monumental movement, but it took everybody in the room saying, what can I do? Pick up the phone, send an email, do this is what you can do. And we got it passed with some tribal provisions. So there's still a lot of work to do there. Again, these conversations, you being here and you taking what you hear here today out to someone else that doesn't know, that's going to be the next action item that needs to happen. Mado.
OCO. No OCOs in response? Oh, Galialiga Jija Donha. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy we're all here. Candessa Tehee Dawado Yoneg, Sealwood Dawado Jalag, Kali Jijalagi Ani Wahadigiawi. So I am a full-blood Cherokee. I'm a Wolf Clan woman. My English name's Candessa Tehee, but my Cherokee name is something different. And the questions that we received prior to the panel were really deep questions, and they really made me think and feel a lot, because as an Indigenous woman, something that I still struggle with, and I don't want to speak for anyone else on the panel, is that as I was growing up, I spent a lot of time hiding from men who might victimize me. And so when we're talking about racial justice, a lot of time what I think about as an Indian woman is believe women, believe Indian women when they say something's going on, believe the whispers that you hear, because the only stories that you hear are the ones that victims are able to tell. They're the ones that survivors are able to tell. So when you hear those stories, believe women. When I think about racial justice, I think about how many Indigenous women are victimized, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that is really where I kind of center my thinking on that question. As someone who is very deeply involved in language revitalization, something that I notice quite often is when there is, a verb, somebody say like the verb unegujit, like somebody's being mad or somebody's like being mean, right? It's always he's being mean. Or if somebody's being playful, he's being playful. Or if somebody is doing something, he is doing something. And so it seems like even when we're talking about language and language revitalization and these places where, like for Cherokee language, it's not gendered. It could be he or she or he. So why even in these language spaces where Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous worldviews should be first and foremost, we're still seeing aspects of colonization within those spaces themselves. And I think I might be drifting off into another question, but in thinking about racial justice, of course I'm thinking about the intersectionality of Indigenous experiences, and I'm thinking we have to protect trans women at all costs. I'm thinking those kinds of thoughts because as a hetero, cisgender woman who is maybe not, I might be the lightest full-blood y'all will ever meet, eh? But it gives me a certain kind of privilege to speak. I'm less threatening than some dark brown Indian man who carries all of this baggage of, being the scary Indian stereotype, maybe. Maybe people find me a little bit more palatable, a little bit more approachable. So I have to say these things for my brothers, for my sisters who aren't able to say these things. And that's what I think about when I'm thinking about racial justice and where Indigenous women are placed. Because we carry more of a burden than just what we need. We have to speak for people in our community who can't speak.
Thank you all. Just as I was hoping, all of your different experiences and career paths and all of that have definitely, given us a really great intersection of what racial justice looks like in indigenous communities and what it means to you all. So this is sort of, a little bit of a different question, although it's definitely very similar, but it's particularly focusing on indigenous voices in racial justice. So indigenous voices, and particularly the concerns and experiences of indigenous women, are often left out of racial justice discussions. How are you changing this dynamic? And who are some of the indigenous women or two-spirits or non-heteronormative indigenous people that you would like to acknowledge and lift up in this moment? I know that a few of you had sort of mentioned folks that you were thinking of earlier, and perhaps you would just want to expound upon the work that they're doing and how they have influenced you.
That was a lot of stuff to answer, Violet. Thank you. Wow, there's a lot of Native, Indigenous women that have inspired me, and I'm definitely not going to remember all of them. One Indigenous woman I can think of immediately is Gloria Nzaldua. She is an Indigenous poet. She's also a trans poet, and she very much is like me, is part Native and also part Chicana, which is a whole mixed bag into itself. And somebody else that's inspired me, even though historically, probably like a lot of Native people, is my mother, even though we've had kind of a difficult relationship. She still is my mother, and she still is my friend, and she is the first Native woman I ever saw go on to grad school and actually become a Native scientist and work specifically for tribes doing scientists through an Indigenous lens, which is now what I do and what I research in currently. So she was a big inspiration for that. I'm forgetting totally like the other parts of the question. Okay, I got it. Okay, now I remember. You put a lot of stuff, and I'm like, I'm going to forget some of this. All right. Okay, now I know what I was going to say. So I think historically, especially with like a lot of the Red Power movement that we saw in the 1970s, who did we see? We saw like the most Indianous-looking Indian males at the forefront, right? And don't for a minute think that there were not Native females. Native females are the backbone of the tribe and of communities and of a lot of this activism. That was what was so rad about the I Don't Know More that's happened, is because it was for the first time you really saw on a large scale Native females coming to the front and feeling comfortable enough to do so, to take charge and lead a movement like that. So I think it's important, and I'm seeing it more and more in Native communities, where even though it's happened for thousands of years, we're just becoming a little bit more vocal and stepping away from the forced colonization that our parents and grandparents kind of ingrained within themselves with the boarding school era with forced assimilation, where they took on kind of these Christian patriarchal stances. And I'm just happy to be living in a time when more Native women feel comfortable to where they are taking charge and being more vocal in the communities, and I should say publicly. They've always done that in the communities, but now it's a public sense. And when you talk to Native females that feel comfortable in a space, you're going to hear a different perspective on their activism and the way that they engage in their activism and the way that they see their family and their community than you are with a Native male perspective, which historically has been Native straight male. They are needed, and we need them too, but we've heard from them a lot, and I especially love hearing from the ladies, and I especially love hearing the perspectives also of our Two-Spirit Native people as well.
It's, there are a lot of reasons why indigenous women's voices have moved off center, because that was not our way, right? So I'm Choctaw. I'm from a matrilineal tribe. The leadership in our tribe was our women, right? The women made the big decisions. They are the ones who owned everything. Our names were passed down through our mothers, our grandmothers. We introduced ourselves that way. When explorers came and wouldn't talk to women, it flipped our tribe on its head in a matter of years, because they would only speak with men. So all of these women who had been groomed for leadership now were in this place where these men were put into these roles. And I think there is a very big difference between patriarchy and matriarchy, right? And there are some people who have a real problem with that, who are like, it is absolutely about balance, but patriarchy oppresses and holds people down, and it minimizes women. Matriarchy doesn't do that. It doesn't oppress men, and it doesn't hold down who they are. It's more of a balance. And so when we're talking about Native women's voices, we had a very different approach back before explorers came. Those voices were much more centralized, but that definitely changed when colonization hit, and they weren't valued. And then we started seeing things like sexual assault that really was not something that was prevalent in our community, now start to become this thing that we have to deal with a lot. And that now it's this horrendous spot in our community that we are now seeing rates of, and I think they're still low. They say 1 in 3. I think it's 1 in 2 now, possibly. But within our group in Matriarch, there isn't a woman that hasn't been touched by, especially sexual violence. And so when you center, when we've come away from those traditional ways of women being empowered and body sovereignty and all of these things, you see a breakdown, right? And then that's when we see all the fractioning happening, and we see all these issues that are now a part of our, unfortunately, that we're having to deal with. The women that I see coming out, and I've seen probably within the last 10 years, this great insurgence of women, Native women, who are rising up and are leading these organizations, a lot of grassroots movements, right? And now we're starting to see that bubble up in different places where they're running for office now, and they're starting to talk about policy, and we're seeing them in these national platforms. And I think it is about damn time, because we have a lot of work to do. And if we don't have that place at the table, then our issues are not going to get heard. It is an incredible opportunity in Indian country right now to get behind our women who are running for office. And the fractioning of Indian country, and we know how that works, but we have this opportunity to come together and support these candidates, so that we can make progress in these areas. And there are so many women doing incredible work. I mean, I'm sitting up here with ladies that I admire. Allison Black is another woman that I really admire. Electa Redcorn, LaDonna Harris, Winona LaDuke. They've all made these huge strides. Jaysha Lyons Echo Hawk, Rain Prodome, and Kim Weiser, and T. Shawnee, all of these ladies. I could go on, I could just sit here for an hour and talk about all the incredible Indigenous women that I know, Summer Wesley and Jacinta Webster and Stephanie Burkhart. And so many of those are contemporary women. They're women doing the work right now. And most of them are doing it without any thanks or any title or anything like that. They're just doing the work. And that to me is incredibly inspiring.
Ditto. Hey. And not to say, I mean, a lot, like you said, I've been influenced by a lot of women in this room. My biggest influence, of course, is my own daughter. I was 16 when I had her, so her life trajectory all depended on what I needed to do for her as her mom, and it changed my worldview tremendously. At the same time, I've always just innately, for whatever reason, just seen other women and what they did. And my mom, I was so grateful. I had a wonderful mom that that made it sound like she's not with me. My mom is a wonderful mom that would take me places and show me these other women. And we didn't grow up in a powwow culture, but she took me to powwows. And I'm like, I want to do that. I want to learn how to do that. And then she'd introduce me to people. And okay, you're going with them for the weekend for a powwow. And they dressed me and showed me how to dance, and and coached me along the way and teaching me those things. And that's what our community is about. It's just like reaching out and saying, okay, you're coming with me and let's go. We're not even, if you want to sometimes, come on, let's go. We're going to go do this today. I was telling somebody earlier, Alice Whitecloud was one of my advisors for All Nations Indian Youth. And when I found out I was pregnant, I was president of the organization at the time. And I was also on a youth council at the time. And the youth council voted to go ahead and let me go, resign my position. And that was fine. It was heartbreaking, but I understood that that's what needed to happen at the time. But then with All Nations, they said, you know what? You're one of us, and we're going to take care of you. We're going to make sure you finish school. We're going to make sure you're not another statistic. And that was the best thing I could hear. I had another girlfriend, she's 17, and she's like, yeah, sure, statistics say you won't finish high school, you'll have another kid before you finish high school, or you won't go to college. And that stuck with me. And it was like, okay, these people get me, and they're going to love me, and they're going to take care of me. I made this mistake, I made this choice, but they're going to wrap themselves around me and say, we're still with you. And that's what we have to do sometimes when bad decisions happen and poor decisions happen, but to say, we're still with you, we're still here with you. Because I could be somewhere else if everybody just said, you know what, good luck, you made this poor choice, go on, we're done with you. So I think that's important, just those women and then those men. The work I've done nationally with the Violence Against Women Act, when we started that movement, like we weren't getting any traction, and it was like, okay, we have to do something different. We're going to have to bring you guys, survivors in to tell their stories, because these congressmen and women are not getting it. They're not understanding what's happening in Indian country. It's like, this is what they see of us. They didn't see us. They didn't see Cherrah Giles from Tulsa, Oklahoma. They seen this mascot image. That's what they knew of Indians in D.C. So we had to go up there and tell our stories. So like reliving that trauma over and over, but in the hopes that it will make the difference. And now we're in the new phase. So now Violence Against Women Act is up for reauthorization in 2018. Now we need to bring those male voices back into the movement with us, because now we have to come up with a different strategy. And so we've been doing a lot of work in the Warriors Honor Women movement, a lot of men, grassroots men doing more of the work too, and saying we need our partners, we need our allies with us to say this happens in Indian country and we're not going to allow this to happen anymore, and we need to be able to protect our women and children in our tribal communities, and we need you, Congress, just to let us do what we're supposed to be doing in our tribal communities. For our Muscogee people, what little is written about us, that was one thing that was written about us, is that you didn't see we didn't see domestic violence and sexual assault occurring in our communities. And when they did, it was written that then if a woman was raped or assaulted, she and her family get to decide what happened to that perpetrator. And that was huge. It gave that power back to that woman. Something was taken from her, but she gets to decide what happens to this perpetrator that caused this offense. So I think that's huge and important, but it's just like Sarah said, Muscogee people, we're matriarchal. We follow our mothers. We have our clans. We follow that system. And I think somewhere over time, our colonialization of our own tribe, because we as Muscogee people are a confederacy, but we've tried to fit this modern day government in what we have now. And I think we'll always struggle with that, because somewhere it got lost in translation, if you will, that men are dominant because men hold traditional places at the ceremonial grounds and women don't hold those positions. So somewhere over time it got lost that, well, women have no power and have no say. You're just meant to be at the camp house cooking. And that's still not the case. If you really learn our culture and our history, it's women, there's that balance. They're consulting with the men. The men are consulting with the women. And it's the women saying, it's time to start dancing. We're ready to cook. We're ready to eat. We keep things going. And we're the life givers. So we have to have that balance there in place. But I'm grateful, because to me, all the Native women that I grew up with and watching and being a mentor to me, as long as I'm 40 years old, and so they're still doing the work. Pam Iron was the director of Indian Healthcare Resource Centers. That was one of the first ladies. All I knew, I was probably 5 years old, seeing she had this big office, she had a secretary, and I was like, that's what I want. I didn't know what that meant. That just looked cool. That's what I want. So I'm grateful that these women have looked beyond a 5-year-old kid and said, okay, I'm going to watch you, I'm going to help you when I can and bring you along. And there's just been, then there's just the women our age. Candessa and I were Cherokee princesses one day. we have our princess days. But I wanted to be able to tell that story too, because I am Cherokee, my dad's Cherokee, and my kids are actually part white. But I want them to be able to say, because if they marry and my grandchildren don't look like me, and they have to tell that my grandma was a Cherokee princess story, it'll be true. But I want them to tell them the rest of the story. Like, what does that mean? What Cherokee princess were you? And can show them the pictures. And I'm not a blue-eyed, blonde-haired lady, but I was a Cherokee princess. And so now that narrative will change over time. If somebody tells you that, then they can, well, tell me about that, because I need my grandkids, if they don't look like me, able to tell that whole story and not be talked about, because we hear about that all the time too. So, long question. I went all kind of around that, but thank you.
In thinking about the question that was asked, I'm the oldest of 4 kids from a single-parent home, raised by a single mom. She got her licensed practical nursing degree from Bill Willis Votech. It was back in the 80s, and it was because it was the fastest thing she could do that made the most money to support her family. Did she really want to be an LPN? I'm not really sure. I'm not even sure if she really thought that far. But she was a nurturer, and she was a caregiver, and she still is. And I appreciate every day the sacrifices that she made so I can be here. And I think about my 2 daughters, and I think about the things that they're doing with their lives. My daughters have more opportunities than I ever had in my entire life. More opportunities than I ever even dreamed about. And it's because of the sacrifices of my mom and her mom that I'm able to do that for them. But I also think about my son. My son, who is a sweet, soft-hearted little boy who still blows me a kiss and waves at me every morning when I drop him off to school. And I think about how these images of savage Indian men with tomahawks, muscles, how they affect him, how he's going to carry those through his life. Because we talk a lot about how patriarchy affects women, how patriarchy affects indigenous women. But patriarchy is a prison for our indigenous men, too. We don't talk about indigenous masculinities or the way that indigenous manhood is threatened by colonial patriarchy, by colonial expectations, that there are these notions that men have to be, men can't cry, men have to be macho. Well, I remember growing up and my grandmother telling me stories, my Elise telling me stories about being at Gâtillon, and Gâtillon is ceremonial grounds in Cherokee, and talking about how the men would stand up there and cry because they knew the days that we would face as Indian people. They knew the days we would face as Cherokee people. They knew the challenges that would come to ceremony, to language, to our way of life. Because our religion is not just something that you do one day a week. It's all through the week. It's every breath we take. It's every choice we make. So when you start talking about misogyny and you start talking about patriarchy, it's as much a prison for our Native men as it is for our Native women. And that's all.
Good. Dang. I'm like, yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and Candessa for taking it to the next level. I appreciate it. Okay, so I guess the next thing that I would like to ask is, what aspects of your work and your life serve as active resistance to cultural appropriation? And what aspects are representative of decolonization? And can you describe the importance of active resistance and decolonization in indigenous communities, lives, families, homes?
Another one of your loaded questions. So I think the first thing that came to mind is how do we actively combat stereotypes and decolonize? And then the first thing that came to my mind is like just getting up out of bed in the morning and going out the door, especially living in a state such as Oklahoma. It can be very, very difficult at times because there's a lot of people here that are 30 years behind in the thinking. And whenever you simply try to have a conversation with them, you can say it in a really angry voice, you can say it in a really calm way, and, trying to play to their side. And it doesn't seem like anything that you do, you're presenting it in such a way, these issues, the mascot issues, just simply respecting our sovereignty, indigeneity, they won't take you very seriously. But then you meet the people that are non-native and they do listen to you, and it makes it worthwhile. And so things that I try to do actively as far as decolonizing is whenever I got, one thing I can immediately think of was when I first got with my partner, the father of my baby, many years ago. In the first few months, I really laid it out, and I said, I come from a matrilineal society. He had historically dated Lakota women. And I was like, I'm not Lakota, I'm Muscogee. It's a very different system of thinking. And so if we're gonna be together, then you gotta understand, like, I kind of, traditionally, the man went to live with the woman's clan, and if things got too out of hand, I can throw your moccasins out the door, and you got to go back to your mom and your family. And he said, okay. And I'm like, welcome to Oklahoma. And so, still even at the home, he considers me head of the household and the final decision maker when it comes to our son and what's best for him. Concerning academics and research, the way I decolonize there is I'm in the hard sciences, which is definitely problematic. It has a long history of racism within Western linear way of doing science. That's where we get eugenics from, which is then where we get blood quantum from. And so the way I go about is, even though I have a history and the certifications and degree in hard sciences, specifically my degree states, I engage in science through an indigenous lens. So when we say an indigenous lens, that means I don't think of it linearly, I think of it in cycles and systems, and that there isn't this taxonomy of humans are up here, and then we have animals, and then plants, and then microspecies, and bacteria, and amoeba. Like, that's not how I think of it whatsoever, is that everything is interconnected, and nothing is more important than the other. And if you take out one part of a system, then you're gonna screw up the domino effect for the rest of it. And just because we can potentially look and use something further doesn't mean we actually should. And what does it actually benefit us? Like, not everything is meant to be understood, and that's kind of like anathema to science, is like we want to understand the crap out of everything, but it's not necessarily something's meant for us to know. And so whenever I've presented at conferences, I've definitely gotten into some arguments with some scientists about that, which is very fun to do. Especially as a native female in the sciences, they just don't know what the heck to do with that. And so when I think of decolonizing, I think of these stereotypes like that we just saw in this film, and how we've been represented as cartoons. They don't see us as scientists or as artists. If they do see us as artists, it's a lot of frozen imagery. And Not the kind of work that, say, Aragon does or Candessa does, making her Dare Woman bags. So you should get one. They're awesome. And then just simply just trying to have these conversations with fellow Native people, and then also with non-Native people, and try to be engaging with them and take different approaches so that they see your humanity and acknowledge it, and not as a cartoon, not as this big-nosed thing.
Hi, Jose.
Your turn.
Okay. So I've never been a big thinker. I've never thought about things in this big, large way. I've always thought about things on a community level. I've always thought about things about my people, my tribe, my sisters, my babies. And I don't think there's anything more motivating than a baby who's hurting, right? So that is something for me that has always been like, you want to make me move fast? Get me around the babies. And that is something that has motivated me more than anything else. And then once I had my own kiddos, realizing that some of these things that I faced as a kid that they're still facing so many years later, that I thought, oh, you know, evolution, we're just going to evolve into a better people. Well, those things don't happen naturally, unfortunately. You know, they take somebody, you know, those ladies that we talked about earlier that paved the way for us, they made those strides to get us to where we are, but we have to take that up and carry it on. The one thing to me, whenever we're talking about decolonizing spaces and issues like this one that gets me every time, is I am less concerned about that Washington team. I am way more concerned with the fact that our babies have to go to schools where they don't get to choose their mascot. They don't get to choose whether or not they're going to support a team. They're in most cases, they are made to buy these T-shirts with these, even here in Tulsa, that have this mascot on them. Our Indian babies have to wear those, and they don't get a choice. And if you're a Native kid in a place with not a lot of Natives around you, guess what happens? You become the mascot. And we've seen that happen over and over again. And so for me, this is low-hanging fruit. It is low-hanging fruit. These are things that we can tackle right now. Yes, they cost money, but in the overall scheme of things, weigh that against the fact that our kids are committing suicide at a rate that astounds me. And we can change that. We can pull this one piece out and do something about it now, because the data is there. And I don't care about conversations anymore. I don't care about controversy. I don't care who cares, who in Indian country likes it, who in Indian country doesn't like it. Not to say anything of outside Indian community. The facts are there. It impacts our kids. It is bad for them. End of story. I don't know of any other industry or any other group of people, when they have those facts in their hands, decide to just go back to, well, let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk about this and decide who wants to be on this side and who wants to be on this side. It doesn't matter. Our babies are hurting. We can do something about it now. If we don't, then it's as good as saying that it's okay. We've got to change this. And I've been a part of a team in Oklahoma City Public Schools that changed a mascot. And was it hard? Yeah, it sure was. Were there people that were really mad at me and came down and were yelling at me? There sure were. But it's okay, because that's what it takes. And we had lots of allies, and there was a team of people that came together and let the students decide, what do they want to see? How do they want to be represented in their community? And that was the most important voice that is really not amplified. What do our youth want to do? What do they think? Because, and in those meetings where we talked about that and said, okay, so what do you want? They're like, we don't want it to be any person. We don't want it to be any human person, because all mascots pretty much are animals, right? And so these conversations are, you know, when we're talking about decolonizing spaces, I think we have to start with our kids' spaces. That's where the biggest impact is going to be felt, and it's probably one of the hardest spaces to get that done, because I don't know why, but people are super sensitive about their mascots and that tie to these athletic teams. And I'm like, how is
It's
that?
the religion of America. Didn't you know that?
Right? I'm just like,
Football.
really? I know. And don't get me started at OU. So, and I know I'm about to make some people mad, but that's the one that has to change too.
Just kind of want to expand upon that because I think it's putting ourselves in those situations too where it is hard to have that conversation. So when you're it's easy to come decolonize when everybody's thinking the same and like ready to move, take action, but it's going into those spaces. And I always applaud Sarah because I see her everywhere, every other nationality and community, telling our stories and getting them to understand, and then where we can relate and where we can partner and be allies and be partners and say, let's change this narrative, let's change this story. For me, it's just exactly that. And I find myself struggling. I've been over 15 years in some capacity with my tribe, and this is the first time in my career, professional career, that I've not have any official capacity with my tribe. And I work for a large company, and I'm one of the few natives in the whole company, and it's hard. I'm like, where's my people at? And trying to get them to understand why these are issues, trying to get them have a conversation every day. And so I kind of got it in my head, I'm going to make sure somebody knows I'm Indian every day. Whether it's, I don't know, my jewelry or my tribe. I didn't let people know I was running for tribal council because I felt like I had to tell them this whole story and explain that to them. But I'm like, but if they don't know, then they don't realize tribes have governments. They don't realize tribes are still very valid and viable and very much a part of this state, and having that conversation. So I made it a point to start letting people know because they start to see my signs around town and they're like, oh, what is this? Tell me about it. And where before I was like, oh, I don't want to tell you again, but that's you have to have that conversation, and it's going to those places where people aren't comfortable. I'm very excited, kind of off track here, but chairwoman of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Just this last week, the movie Wind River, how many of you seen Wind River? It's about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And when I seen that movie at the AMC here in Tulsa, the audience was majority non-Native. And you can hear them sigh, and you can hear them gasp, and at the end it gives some statistics and some information, and they were like, oh my gosh. But then they walk out, and it's no big deal. I'm about to cry, vomit, all this stuff, because it just brings up a lot of emotion. And I told my girlfriend that was with me, I was like, we have to do something, because they don't get this happens in Tulsa, Oklahoma every day. They don't get there's Indians here. They don't get there's tribal jurisdiction, and there's these same issues. It's not just reservation up north. This isn't 1920. This is 2017. So we have some more work to do to keep carrying that conversation, to get those people that are out in the community to say, hey, this is what's happening in our communities. Let's carry on this conversation, and how you can be a part of that and help change that narrative, because they have to know more of that story. So we have to decolonize all those spaces around us that we live and work in. She said it earlier, we wake up and we're in two different worlds all day long. And having to be that, I'm very fortunate, my husband is a Muscogee man, and we don't follow traditional roles. He cooks, he cleans, he does all that stuff. He watches the kids most of the time while I'm out running around, making the money. No, but we tell that, and he is a man that cries. He is a man that, like, our relationship is just different in that way, and people don't get that sometimes. They're like, so he does what, and he does what, and he's not the father of my children. He doesn't have any children of his own. So I like kind of telling him and bringing him up, because he's one of those rare breeds, and I like how Candessa brought that up. He doesn't have to be this big muscle-bound man making, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and wife come home and you have the dinner ready. And like I said, there's a lot of times he's actually the one taking care of the kids. His friend is actually Ian Washburn, because my husband's from the Washington, D.C. area. So he grew up in this environment where he's the only Indian. All D.C., his mom's attorney, she's the only other Indian. But at his school, it's him and his brothers. And Ian actually called him when he got into this movement and said, Justin, I didn't realize what you were saying, because they went to a football game, and for Justin to tell him, my husband, to say, they're making fun of my people, and then they were just in high school back then, and Ian called him up, and he said, I just want to apologize because I didn't get it then. I get it now. So that movement that Ian is doing, Ian's non-native, but he's starting that rebrand in Washington. They're actually been doing a petition drive, so they'll keep doing that work. And we applaud that. Again, he's non-native, but he grew up with a friend that is native, but it's taken this long to get his mind to change and realize what that R word meant, what it really, how hurtful it can be. So it's taken some time, but it can be done. As you said, we can change these environments. It takes a little bit of work and effort, takes some money, but these things can be done. And it's just being safe enough in ourselves to say, we have to do something because nobody else is going to do it for us.
I always have to take a minute to think. I know I've had lots of time to think, but I still have to take a minute to think. And I realized too that, I talked about my daughters, I talked about my son, I talked about my mom, but, there's some really great Indian women who are fighting the fight in their own ways. And Arrogant Star is definitely one of those women. And I admire and look up to the work that she does, because graphic novels are very much a boys' club. And I can't imagine some of the ignorance and some of the hurtful things that Arrogant has encountered as she has been an independent publisher of her own work, which is huge. I mean, that is just huge. I think about Shan Gosshorn with the work that she does, taking traditional Cherokee double wall baskets, using archival images, hand tinting, combining that with legislation such as the Violence Against Women Act, and creating really, really, really amazing artwork that speaks to people on a completely different level. There are people who will turn away from survivor stories, but when they look at Shan's work, they don't realize that's what it's about. And as they engage with her work and as they see that work, then they're opened up in a completely different way. So thinking about decolonizing spaces, sometimes it almost feels like you have to trick people into listening to you sometimes. Hey, look over here, look at this hand. But guess what? What I really want to talk to you about is, violence against women. I want to talk to you about Indian education. I want to talk to you about tribal sovereignty. I want to talk to you about water rights. I want to, when I was in grad school in anthropology, because I'm an anthropologist of all things, one of my professors would say, you have to be prepared for the Bubba question. And that's really classist and a little racist maybe, but he was a white guy. So if he was a white guy and he said it, then I can say it, right? No, just kidding. I say enjoy, but and that means I'm joking in Cherokee. But and that question is, why does any of this matter? Why does any of this matter? If you have, and a lot of times, the people that we encounter during the day, we have maybe 20 or 30 seconds with them. And we don't know what seeds that we plant are going to flower further down the road. Just like Cherrah was talking about with her husband's friend, who's now part of this movement to rebrand the Washington Redskins. We don't know how our interactions are going to take hold and what legacy they're going to leave. So we have to be educated. And in thinking about decolonization, there's someone that I encounter in the museum environment. He'll say, I wonder how many times I'm going to hear decolonization at this conference. Because we can talk about these things, but, if I'm talking to, Edud and Elise, what's decolonization to them? How do you say decolonization in Cherokee? How do you talk about these things? How do you talk about them? How do you talk about this concept in indigenous ways? And I think that's a really difficult conversation to have. I'm not really sure what the right question is, what the right verbiage is, what the right words are, but I think we're having a good conversation now, and I'll stop talking.
I have a quick question.
We're like, bam.
I do have a quick question for the audience. If you would humor me, raise your hand if you are Native in this room. Okay, so for all of you that did not raise your hands, we're counting on you, because I hate to say this, but oftentimes with non-Native people, they're more likely to hear about the struggles of what's going on with Native people or anybody from a community of color if it's coming from somebody of their own ethnicity. They are more likely to listen to what you have to say than just another damn angry brown person. So I hope you're taking in what we're saying and it's palatable enough to where you're going to go back to your communities and shed some light within them.
And I love that you brought that up. Are we asking the right question? Should we be talking about decolonization, or should we be talking about indigenizing? Like, indigenizing is, oh, thank you very much. Indigenizing spaces, right? So how do we can talk less about, well, we could decolonize all day long and still not be in a healthy place for indigenous people. Indigenizing is taking back or not taking back, pulling back up what's always been ours, what has always been there, and just reinstituting those things into our lives. That's all. Sorry.
Thank you all very much. So let's see. I think that it's sort of nearing time to wrap up. We're sort of approaching 9:30 a little quickly, but I was hoping that you all could sort of just discuss, what remaining remarks do you have for the audience, and if there is, one or two things that you want each audience member to walk away with, maybe words of inspiration, maybe another question that you want people to think about and reflect on over the next week or so, what might that be?
I'll go first this time.
Thank you, because I didn't know what I was going to say. I gotta be Candessa and really think about it.
I said I'm ready, but I'm just pausing for a second. It's dramatic effect. Degadageusesti. It's a Cherokee word. The root is about love. Degadageusesti. It means that we're all supposed to love each other. And it's not just for Cherokees to other Cherokees. It is for humans to other humans. We are all in this struggle of humanity together. And if one of us falls down, we all fall down. And so it's our responsibility in this global community to look out for each other and to hold each other up and to struggle together through I'm about to sound like Prince, through this thing we call life.
How do we follow that up?
But they gotta get you say. We're all supposed to love each other. So even that person who you don't like, that person who you see them in the aisle at Walmart and you want to duck down and go the other way, you're still supposed to love them, and you're supposed to love something about them. All of us, we're not one thing or the other. We're more than one thing. And I think when you start thinking about things like gender and sexuality, as we're becoming more enlightened, those things become more apparent. Those things are a continuum. They're a spectrum. It's not either or. It's not black and white. So that's, I guess, my final message is just we all need to love each other more.
Thank you. I'm ditto again. That's tough to follow up for sure. But just like this movie is titled More Than a Word, it is more than a word to us. It's whether they're talking about the R word or any other word, because this is our lives. I do want to acknowledge the non-natives in this room. Sometimes I think we were at a panel discussion a couple of weeks back, and someone in the room was like, well, what is Indian country? You guys make it sound like this mystical place, and how do you get there, and what do you do there? How do I come to Indian country? What does that mean?
I thought that was Nativia,
yeah.
Remember?
So that's where it is, where we all fly off to. But so I say that for those that don't quite get what Indian country means, or that they're feeling still like distant from us. come talk to us afterwards. Find us on Facebook, find us on social media. You hear so often, a lot of times, especially in this state, I've never been to a powwow. Fry bread's not really an indigenous food, but I've never ate an Indian taco. Those sorts of things. My kids go to Jinx Public Schools. We're gonna host our first Stomp Dance and Powwow because we realize we need to get our community understanding what our issues are for our Native students there, and that there are Indians. We had our kids in the homecoming parade, and they're like, there's Indians. Look, they're dressed up. What is that? So to even start that conversation with them, create, a safe space for them to come and see, okay, this is what we do when we're not at school. And yeah, we live in your neighborhoods, we live in your houses, we go to your classes, but then sometimes we have our ceremonies and we have our languages, and these are the things that make us different. And we eat these more than fry bread. For my people, we eat sofki and Chattahoochee, and I don't eat sour cornbread, but we have those things there too. So just introducing those first. So if anybody's feeling like, hey, I'm not quite feeling connected to this, or you're not speaking to me directly, we got to do a better job as Native people too, to reach out to those across the aisle and really saying, let's take you to our mystical, magical place of Indian country so you can better understand that and what that means. So be action oriented, be like, how can we continue to love each other, to uplift each other, because the better we all are, then the better off all of our communities are. Motto.
I guess my takeaway for everybody is you saw the movie, and there was a quote in here, and I don't know who said it, is once you learn it, you can't go back, right? So now you are responsible for the information that you now have, which is an honor and a privilege, but it's also a burden. It can be a burden sometimes, right? To pass that on. And so my ask of you tonight is to talk to somebody about this. So if everybody in here tweets about it or Facebooks about it, I know I probably wasn't supposed to do this, but I took a bunch of screenshots. I was like, oh my God, look at all my friends doing cool work. Anyway, I'm going to Facebook about it, and I'm going to tell people about it. And when they say, what is that about? I'm going to spend more than, how many characters to talk about that. And I also, one other challenge is these things are going on all over the United States. Here in Tulsa, we're trying to start a Native charter school just to get around the fact that we have to deal with these issues on the daily, right? If we could remove all these barriers for our kids so they could just learn, they didn't have to do land run reenactments or deal with Native mascots or deal with inaccurate histories or deal with our boys being bullied because of their long hair, they could just learn. What would that be like? So supporting these efforts from Indian country to try to change things for our kids, but to also, throw your support behind that. When somebody says that R word, and don't use that word anymore. Don't use it, even when you're talking about this issue. We should be calling it the R word like we call it the N word. It's the same thing. And whenever somebody uses it, challenge that and say, why are you still using that term? Can I talk to you about it? Are you open to a conversation about that word? So that would be my challenge. And I just want to thank Violet and the group here at Circle Cinema. It costs money to put this on. That's why it's not in every theater everywhere, which I wish it was. And so I really appreciate the organization and the time that you've taken to prepare this space so we could have this conversation. Yakoki.
Well, being at the end of all of that, what more can I say and add for final takeaways that they haven't already?
You're going to need Prince lyrics.
Is that because my name's Apollonia? So I think what I would like the audience to take away is it's like what Sarah said. Once you've learned something, you can't unlearn it. So what are you going to do with it now? It's on you. It's stuck. It's there. So for the Native people in the room, go back to your respective communities, have these conversations with your spouses and your children, most importantly, and let them know that it's okay for them to disagree with their teacher in the classroom about if they want to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, about if they want to use the R word, if they want to be called a brave. That was the high school I went to, Central Braves. And to keep having these conversations in your community, and to also recognize and acknowledge that just because we're talking about the mascots tonight and how it's not an accurate representation of Native people, that it is all connected. By talking about this, maybe this is what we're doing tonight, because it is connected to on another night when perhaps me and Cherrah are at a matriarch meeting and we're talking about domestic violence issues. We're talking about what happened at Standing Rock. And you may not see it, but it is all connected. And for the non-Native people in the room, if you consider yourself, I mean, I really appreciate you coming out and taking the time to come see something that may be out of your comfort zone and to trying to learn about what's going on in a different community other than yours. If you consider yourself to be an ally or one of those like down white people, then what I ask of you is represent us when we are not there being represented. When you're in a space where it's all white people, or at least non-Native, non-brown people, however you want to word that, and you hear somebody talking about the R word or about another Native issue like, God, those drunk Indians, or what are they so mad about? You have something, a little something to work with now, to where you can now say something. And that counts for a lot for another Anglo person to tell another Anglo person. Actually, I kind of disagree with you on that. Here's why. So that's what I can think of how you can also contribute to the conversation too, because you're also a part of it. Mado.
And thank you, Galialichisi, Violet, for putting the panel together. And thank you to the other panelists and to Circle Cinema. I neglected to say that, so I'm really glad Sarah said it.
I have to say it too, because I'm going to feel bad if I don't. I totally forgot. Thank you, Violet. Thank you, Circle Cinema. And thank you, Dustin, for watching my baby.
You get bonus points for that.
Not all heroes wear capes.
All right, yeah, let's give our panelists one last round of applause. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope that you enjoyed the film, and I hope that you enjoyed the wonderful, very special discussion that was happening up here in this area. And I hope that there are a lot of things that you can take away from it and reflect on and, you know, just sort of let it permeate throughout the rest of your life. So thank you very much.